You are listening to Danièle's podcast. On Danièle's podcast, we dive into everything that drives the DIY scene, past and present. The music, the movement, the mindset. This interview series with Michael Murphy is inspired by his latest book, Pop Music Management: Lessons from the Managers of No1 Albums, published by Routledge. Music managers look after their artists, but who looks after the managers? And what about the sometimes intricate dynamics that shape their working relationships? In this episode, Michael analyzes the fascinating world of matching and often contradicting narratives that define the manager-artist connection. To kick off, I asked Michael about the relationship between Lou Adler and Carole King, one of the most positive dynamics in music history.
Yeah, Tapestry, iconic album, brilliant. A brilliant capsule of the moment that pop music started mining people's emotions on a very deep and meaningful and relevant way. So it's a very important album from that point of view. And it's an album made by a woman who felt incredibly secure creating because of her manager, Lou Adler. So it's a lovely story of management at its best. Carole King is an extraordinarily gifted songwriter, is one of the great songwriters of the last 150 years. And she knew the music industry inside out, and she had no interest in being a pop star. Thought, I write songs, other people sing them, they become famous, I get paid, so it's not all bad, and life is good. But that's who I am. I'm the songwriter. I'm behind the scenes. And Lou Adler thought, you're more than that. And she had a band that was kind of a fun project. And Lou Adler said, look, I've got a record label. I'd put out your record, but it would just be you, wouldn't be the band, that they could still play with you. But from a marketing point of view, it makes sense for you to be the 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 brand, for the sales to be based around you. And I said, like, I don't want to be a pop star, so I'm not going to do the things that anyone who wants to be a pop star would do. I'm not going to go on the road. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to, do all the things that people do when they're chasing publicity. Sometimes um, box you into a certain way of performing your existence. So Carole King said, it's not for me. And he said, well, what you can do is any songs that you have written that you think are good and no one else has recorded them, because that's her job, write songs, other people record them, you do them, and that way those songs get to live. Now, we know how good these songs are from the sales of Tapestry. It's one of the biggest selling albums of all time. And we know that she felt very, very secure. She doesn't write a lot about Lou Adler, but she writes about how he took care of every aspect of her business, designing the albums, or working with the art people, sequencing the albums. She'd go in, record them, you think, yeah, put that song first, because radio, retail, when they hear it, the first impression can count. Sometimes artists are very precious about the sequencing of the record, the order in which the songs come. He persuaded her to do a little bit of touring, to do some showcases, and she was wildly acclaimed as a performer. People thought she was extraordinary, and she was. But it just wasn't something that she saw, whereas her manager saw you could be incredibly successful as a solo artist. And he was right, but he created a very, I think, like Carly Simon with Arlene Rothberg, her manager, and probably with Janice Ian, and Jean, they made life feel very, very safe for their artists, and safe in a sense that make your music and I'll do the other bits. Now, I'll involve you if you want to be involved, but if you don't want to be involved, we mentioned Linda Ronstadt at a previous episode as well. I'll just get on and do the business. Like I'll consult you, I'll tell you, so nothing will be a surprise. But that there's a great sense of care from the great managers. And you mentioned the narrative. If the Malcolm McLaren story is really different to the story of Bow Wow Wow, and they are completely different narratives about the same thing in the same process. But we generally only get the narrative from the famous person, from the person who can sell the books. That's another industry overlapping the book industry overlapping with pop music. But that whole sense of does your manager care about you? And someone asked me about what's the one thing you should look for in a manager? Like what's your tip? What should an artist be seeking? I said, does your manager care? And do they care about you rather than themselves? And to me, the Carole King example and Lou Adler is a fantastic example of that.
In the case of Britney Spears, I asked Michael about the challenges of managing a talent so immense it could stand on its own, yet whose personal circumstances often made things complicated and at times even awkward.
Well, the Britney Spears example is fascinating for me because she's an icon. She's a celebrity. She's one of the most famous people on the planet, or certainly was, 20 years ago, when at her commercial height. Uh, I wouldn't know enough to say was her manager good or bad. I think her manager was brilliant actually, because she had a huge, huge debut album that set up a career. And she's had a very, very long career. But rather than just her manager, which is why management becomes so important, including self-management, including the artist being involved with key decisions with how they live. It goes beyond manager and it goes into the industry that they work in. And at the start of her career, Britney Spears is an example of a young person who worked tenaciously and with intelligence and with very, very few resources. So early career is pure DIY. She's from a very poor family. She gets, finally she gets her breakthrough with the Mouseketeers, with the Disney section for young performers that's aimed at young people through their TV show. And Britney Spears' family are so poor that when her grandmother dies, she can't afford to go to the funeral. And nor can her mother, who's on the set of the Disney series with her. And they have to borrow money from their friend, and their friend is Justin Timberlake's mother. So Justin Timberlake's mother was really, really good to this child star, who is a star but isn't making much money. So the trauma of Britney Spears, you can get a better sense of it when you think that, okay, so she was part of a pop couple, part of a celeb couple, Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake, and then they split up and there's all the trash talking, the celebrity that seems to fuel celebrity headlines. But that trauma was breaking up with the family, the Timberlakes, who had been so supportive and so nurturing and must have been so important to this young person from rural America. So I think understanding Britney Spears' career means understanding to some level her trauma, her sense of trauma. And in her autobiography, she describes being traumatized by the music industry and the expectations of that industry of a young woman. And we all need to think about, what do we expect of the pop music artists that whose records we buy or whose videos we watch or who we read about? Are we satisfied that someone is caring for them? And I would say that as an industry, the music industry didn't do a great job of caring for Britney.
There are also cases where managers play a key role in helping an artist break beyond their own style and into a new genre, like Solar Cliff with Johnny Cash. And then there are times when everything seems to go well for both the manager and the artist, yet differing narratives emerge, leading to unexpected outcomes.
when I was doing my big spreadsheet with the thousands of entries, I was wondering, like, what percentage of number one managers, how many weeks at number one were managers from outside of America? Now, I never finished the spreadsheet because I'd still be doing it, to be honest. But I found what might be the earliest example of a manager outside of America who goes to number one, and that's Gene Harcourt Powell. And then the first man who goes to number one, I think, is Saul Hotliff with Johnny Cash. He wasn't a music manager. So Johnny Cash was around. He was an icon. He was a movie star, but he didn't sell huge quantities of records. He wasn't the biggest box office attraction. He was a consistent performer, consistent earner, but he wasn't a superstar that he became. And his first number one album was with this Canadian who sold burgers. He had a restaurant, and a sideline was putting on gigs. And when he'd put on gigs in Ontario, he'd get the artists come down to the burger place and sign autographs. So he was promoting his burgers with the artists who he brought in to play concerts. And Johnny Cash thought, yeah, you're great at doing business. I'd like you to be my manager. So I said, well, I'm not a manager. But he became the manager, and that's where we get Johnny Cash's first number one album. And that's when country music, which is now one of the defining genres, along with hip hop in the States, it's when we get country music as a number one, not just in the country charts, but in the mainstream charts. And we get it as the kind of concert attraction that it has continued to be. And it's kind of an outsider. It's someone who's not got a long legacy of managing acts, which again hopefully encourages people who think I'd love to manage an act, but you have to be serious, you have to be wealthy, you have to have loads of resources, you have to have loads of experience. You don't, yeah. So here's proof that you don't. And the Saul Hotliff story shown, Canadian, kind of an outsider who totally transformed the global pop culture landscape because he shows the commercial possibilities of country music. John Denver section was interesting to research because it was an example of the manager wrote an autobiography, and so did the artist. And the stories don't coincide. There's a serious disconnect. So you might be a very, very successful manager. Your client might be doing extremely well. You might be making lots of money. Every month, you might be sending a check to your client. You take your commission, 15 or 20%. The client gets most of the money, and you assume that they're happy. The opposite might be true. And in the John Denver case, it certainly was the case where John Denver thought that the manager is doing more for himself than for me. And it brings the story back because Denver's manager was a huge fan of Colonel Tom Parker and that old style, almost carnival. He felt that you have to look, doesn't matter about the coasts. Now we hear this language sometimes is coming up again. It's not about the coast, the elite on the coast. It's middle America or where the audience is. And John Denver was branded as an icon who could be very, very appealing to middle America as well as the coast. But the manager and the act had very, very different feelings about what was going on.
Coming up in the final part of our interview, what about the artists who don't need a manager? Join us in our next installment as we explore the fascinating, multifaceted talents of Bobby Gentry, the ultimate DIY starter, Dave Grohl, and more.